What's going on, everyone? Welcome to a snippet from an upcoming episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast featuring Dr. Guillermo Escalante and Dr. Scott Stevenson, where we discuss their recent publication on peak week recommendations for bodybuilders. In this segment, we go over a presentation of an unpublished study from Bill Campbell at the recent ISSN conference. In this study, they looked at the effects of a severe energy deficit on body composition outcomes in recreationally trained lifters. About halfway through the video, Dr. Stevenson briefly touches on the design of the study as well as the results. To fill in some gaps, the participants had an average body fat of about 20%, from what I recall. However, both males and females were included, so 20% is the average from combining the body fat percentage of all participants. So take that with a grain of salt. Another valuable detail is that the participants underwent a baseline monitoring period for a couple of weeks to establish weight maintenance energy intake and activity levels. The training intervention in this study was not standardized between participants, so it wasn't a general routine of, say, 4 times per week, upper lower split, where all of the participants performed the same exercises with the same amount of volume. Instead, records were obtained from the baseline monitoring period for each individual's resistance and cardiovascular exercise routine, and they were then asked to maintain this program during the nutrition intervention, i.e., the severe energy deficit. All right. Enjoy this short chat with Dr. Guillermo Escalante and Dr. Scott Stevenson, and be sure to tune in Friday for the full podcast episode.
Well, I'll go ahead. No, I think Bill did a really good job in explaining, his population and who he's most focused on, and I think he advertises that, hey, this is for people that are just trying to lead that healthy balance, whatever that means, and trying to find that balance. They want to look better, they want to be healthier, they want to be fitter. They're not necessarily the people that are going to try to get down to striated glute level, and that's not the population he works with. And, even though he reaches for people that are more resistance trained, but at the same time, it's like Bill said, that's not his specialty. That's not what he's trying to focus on. And in a sense, I like that because it really applies to a larger percentage of the population.
Right,
I mean, it's
right.
really applicable to most people. I mean, most people that we talk to, they are not interested in walking around with striated glutes. They don't care,
Right.
and that's the whole difference. And I think that's the difference where we are. There's a little crossover, obviously, in what we do, and we can learn and have some takeaway. But we need to understand that we have to really look at those populations that we're studying and see what we're doing. And as Bill actually said, is it's really hard to study the bodybuilding population because I mean, and we were discussing this together because I mean, you're getting ready for a show, you're 16 weeks out, you spend a whole year getting ready for this. It's like, are you going to want to, have somebody else drive your ship and tell you what to do and what you can't do? And maybe you're in the placebo group, right? And you're not getting the best possible treatment. Who's going to want to do that study that's a real competitor? So there are a lot of limitations in our research, and thus we're kind of left with a lot of observational stuff. And that's where we have to kind of make those inferences from that.
So one thing, folks who don't know, Bill's research that he presented it wasn't actually complete. I think they're missing some of the analyses, but the basic format, if I remember it correctly, is they really severely dieted some recreational trained individuals, 2 different groups. I think they went to they were down around, we calculated somewhere around 8 calories per pound.
Oh, really? Was that
on average? And one group dropped the calories down by 25% for the first 2 weeks, and then 50% for the next 2 weeks. And the other group went, I think, 37.5% for both of those 2-week periods. And they found that they were actually able to lose basically entirely fat without fat-free mass loss. So it's pretty, I mean, that's a really low caloric deficit to have. That's a really low caloric intake to have. but it proved not to be deleterious. Of course, you've got a situation, these were recreationally trained individuals. They were checking, and they had sort of personal coaches, each and every one of them, to make sure they're on target. They also had dropouts, and I think there was a fairly large number. I don't want to say that I remember exactly. I was thinking it was maybe 10 out of like 40 or something like that may have dropped out. So they had a number of people. Be interesting to see why those individuals dropped out, if it was purely psychological, or maybe that would have been that portion of the population who wouldn't have done nearly as well as the rest of those who stayed in the study did, as far as holding on to side, because they sensed this was happening. They were getting weaker. Training was too difficult. They weren't going to be able to hold the size because they wouldn't be able to maintain the training stimulus. So, but the thing that does kind of come to mind, and I mentioned this, I think at dinner, or maybe even while the talk was going on, there's a guy, shout out to Martin McDonald, if he happens to listen to this. He's well known in the UK. He has really focused, I've heard him at least in the last year or so. Actually, it was 2 or 3 years ago, maybe, at Body Power. He had an entire talk on this very notion of really pushing the calories down and how well people can do with that sort of a caloric deficit. And even one of Stu Phillips' studies that came out in the last year and a half or so, where they had really high protein intake and a really severe caloric deficit, those individuals gained muscle mass during that short-term study. So those things can definitely kind of be done. And the thing that that's interesting is, I mean, I have seen with highly, and I've done this myself. It's one of the first steps I take with highly trained competitors who may have been in a situation where they're taking in 4.5, 5, 6,000 calories, and have them just drop back to something that is sort of an ad lib feeding. They don't necessarily have to go right to dieting, but that might be from, if it were 6,000 down to 4,000 and maintain their protein intake, that's a 2,000 calorie a day jump. And what that will do, of course, is pull off a lot of the water that comes from the inflammation and everything with eating that much food, the sodium, what have you. But it can mean, because if they've sort of plateaued, given their NEAT, everything goes into expenditure versus intake, if they've plateaued at a caloric intake of, let's say, 6,000 calories. I use that magic number because it's 6 1,000 calorie meals, and that's where I had gone several times in the past. It's not very fun to do, and people go past that. But if all of those expenditure variables stay in place and you drop from 6 to, let's say, 4 or 4.5, that's a 1,500 calorie deficit if you're presuming that there's no metabolic adaptation there going on, or at least maybe 1,000. And you can do that and be quite comfortable and really have suffered a really severe caloric drop from where you once were in that context, and not lose any muscle and be just fine and have really rapid fat loss. So I take that study, or the sort of pre-published study, and think, okay, is there any scenario where that kind of thing would apply? Definitely 4,000 calories is not 8 calories per pound. That's a world of difference. But the notion that some people might have is like, okay, I'm at 6,000 calories. Now I'm going to have to start my diet by going down to like 5,600 for a week and 50, and incrementally just, it's like, no, you can actually get away with that because you're still at 4,000 calories a day. That's still a good, even, for someone who's 250 pounds, that's still a decent number of calories. That's not going to cause muscle loss. So that there is sort of a principle that's tested and demonstrated in those sorts of things. And I try to look for those hidden kind of gems where you literally, if you take the study, in this case, a Bill study, and try to extract external validity from that to individuals who are highly trained, it's like, can we actually drop them to 8 calories per pound, or give them a 50% caloric drop from their baseline caloric balance intake? Well, no, it's probably not going to work too well for someone who's really been at it for a while. But on the other hand, a 37.5% drop would not put someone who's at 6,000 calories down to 8 calories per pound, because at 6,000 calories, they're at 22, 25 calories per pound, depending on what they weigh, of course. So that percentage drop actually is doable in a different context if you look at it from a relative standpoint versus what happens in terms of the calories per pound of body weight. So I think, another example, while I'm sort of rambling here, one I probably we may even talked about this too, Mike, is, speaking of Brad, was that high volume study that received so much criticism in years past. And thinking, well, no one trains that way. There's no way you can get away with 45 sets, it all taken a failure, like you'd be destroyed. But still, there was sort of a principle that was found there of somewhat of the inverted U hormesis, or at least a law of diminishing returns type of phenomenon, which I think you can take that idea and say, well, you know what, I'm not going to be doing 45 sets to failure, but there might be a difference for me between 15 sets being too much or not quite optimal, or 8 sets not being enough and 12 sets being more. So the dose response idea came out of that, and that fits obviously with many other studies. So that notion is there in the meta-analysis they've done, that the data there. So you can take that idea of dose response in terms of muscle growth or hypertrophy, if you want to use that kind of limited term, and training volume, and apply that to you and say, well, 45 sets is definitely no go. And Brad's was not claiming that to be a prescription. I don't think, Bill wasn't claiming this is a prescription, obviously, as you said,
Right.
Whatsoever for a highly trained person. But there's some notions that can be had there that maybe if you're at a decent caloric intake, you're not already in a deficit, you're not already undergone a metabolic adaptation, you're not already drained so much that your NEAT is going to be just, rock bottom, and the last thing you want to do is get off the couch or even get out of bed in the morning, that you can go through and suck it up for 2, 3, 4 weeks and maybe hold on to muscle mass while you're still able to train hard, you stick to your guns, and do what would be some sort of a caloric toggling or refeed type of scenario where you even intersperse. And I think this is maybe something they're going to maybe do down the line, is what happens if you do severe caloric restriction, then with an increase in calories that would happen in between there. So you're able to sort of suffer through a week or two where you have rapid fat loss before you start to lose fat-free mass or muscle mass. And so there's maybe something to be gleaned from there. Those are just some thoughts that come to mind. And last thought is, there's a guy, I'll give him a plug because I think I mentioned this to Chris. Maybe I mentioned it when we were talking. Ken Skip Hill, goes by Skip. He looks like Skip LaCour, a bodybuilder of old, so that's kind of his nickname. He's been doing skip loading for like 20 years, and it's based on a fairly strict and severe diet during the week, and then a massive skip load on the weekend. He doesn't really care if the scientific community knows about that or not. But I've been seeing him doing that personally. I was a moderator with him on Intense Muscle. It works phenomenally. Like, he's got literally hundreds, if not maybe more than 1,000 clients he's done that with since the late 90s. And that's evidence right there for me. That's just screaming like it works. Sets people up for some disordered eating now and again because you're doing a binge, dietary purge type of thing. But anyway, so those are some thoughts on taking that, that scientific evidence and figuring out some way to at least find if there's a notion that might support things you've seen otherwise in a different context, sort of in the trenches in the real world.
Yeah, Dr. Stevenson, I think that's an excellent point. So to recap there, we saw in this unpublished data that basically a 2-week severe deficit in recreationally trained people didn't have a significant effect on fat-free mass, right? So they maintained fat-free mass. And from my perspective, what I've been seeing more in the evidence-based community is this idea of being more aggressive with mini cuts, right? So when you're in the off season, it's pretty common nowadays to have these frequent mini cuts of maybe 2 to 6 weeks at most, and people have become accepting of really pushing that deficit and saying, well, you're coming from your peak off-season body weight, you're not super lean at this point. You shouldn't really be scared of a severe deficit and a risk of muscle loss over a few weeks. And that also brings me back to Dr. G, your presentation where you touched on the German volume training study, where this study was looking at competitive bodybuilders at the beginning of their contest prep. And man, the deficit was severe at first. I don't know if you remember the figures as far as the actual deficit and their starting body fat and stuff, but it seemed like in that one, there was the confounder of anabolics, I believe, but there wasn't any significant muscle loss there either with significant deficit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, there were the one limitation to that study is there was no comparison group to the no refeed group. So both groups got a refeed. But the body fat percentage starting point was roughly about 11-ish for both groups. And the caloric restriction, we had a severe caloric restriction, which was defined as greater than a 40% deficit, and then a moderate caloric restriction, which was defined at less than 40%. And if you actually looked at the data of the deficit, basically the severe caloric restriction group was still eating a decent amount, but they have a high caloric expenditure throughout the day. They were dieting at about 2,500 calories. whereas the moderate caloric restriction was dieting at about 2,900 calories. But exactly as you said, over the course of that period of time, they actually didn't lose any fat-free mass, and they implemented these refeeds. And they're going through, even in the severe caloric restriction at 40% deficit, that's actually right up there with basically a little bit higher than Bill's, 37.5%. And this is in trained bodybuilders over a period of time. Yes, we have the confounding variable of the anabolics, but this is kind of to Scott's point, to where you can actually take some of these and understand it. And what we can infer from this study or hypothesize is like, hey, we can go on a very aggressive caloric restriction for a full week, eat up on the weekends and refeed. And they didn't go to overboard; they were going to maintenance. Actually, they stayed a little bit below maintenance. And they were able to successfully retain that fat-free mass. So that's why I really like that study, because you can kind of, again, take pieces from this information, pieces from that information, and then you can triangulate the information and really try to make some potential hypotheses that I think would probably be more applicable to our community, our tribe.